While the techniques for de-escalating crisis and preventing crisis are very useful, they are not foolproof, and there are some situations in which crisis might happen. In these situations, it's very important to have some concrete tools to use. We've broken down the steps to managing a crisis into 5 main steps. The first is ensuring physical safety. The second, de-escalating the situation. The third, hearing what the child has to say and validating their experience. The fourth, sitting down with the child and making a plan. And lastly, preparing that child to rejoin the group. In all of our work, physical safety of the kids that we're working with is the top priority. So it's really important to know your program's policies, especially in regards to touching children or physically intervening in the situation. When crisis occurs, make sure that the kids that you're working with are physically safe, as well as the staff who has responded to the situation. When necessary, make sure to relocate the discussion if the environment is not a safe space, and don't be afraid to call for help, as others might be able to deal with the situation from a less emotional place. In regards to de-escalation of a crisis, there are 4 major strategies that we're going to cover, and the first of those strategies is to use your voice. Given that children tend to anchor themselves in your tone and mood, it's important to use a very firm, commanding tone when trying to de-escalate the situation. In terms of volume, the standard rule of thumb is to be as loud as you have to be, but not any louder. Speaking in those sharp, short bursts will allow you to be commanding without having to shout or rant, which might cause the child to escalate further. When order has been restored and you've regained the children's attention, try to bring the volume and the energy of the room down by speaking softly and slowly and using a deep, lower voice. In instances where a dispute has caused the crisis to elevate, one de-escalation technique that's fairly obvious is to separate the 2 disputants. In the cases that there are limited staff, it's important to think strategically and prioritize who to talk to first. Before any conversation is had, hone in on any first aid needs that have presented themselves as a result of the crisis. After those first aid needs have been met, it's time to check in with the child who will be on hold, just to ensure that he or she knows that they're a priority as well. Giving that child on hold something to think about or to do while they're waiting is crucial, as it will allow them to reflect on what happened. Giving those children the task of thinking about what happened, thinking about why they're upset, or drawing their feelings out are all good techniques to use. Using your body language strategically might also help you to de-escalate crisis. When thinking about your body language, remember the 3 C's: connecting with the child, showing confidence, and showing caring. To connect with the child, you should make eye contact and move down to the child's level if it is safe to do so, as you can see in the picture to the right. Show confidence in your posture, and that will reflect confidence in yourself and to the child. You might also show confidence by nodding your head reassuringly as the child is talking, and by facing the child directly instead of crossing your arms or crossing your legs. You can show caring by simply focusing on the discussion and showing that you really want to hear what the child is saying and understand that child's perspective of how the situation came about. Equally important to leveraging your body language, you also want to use language to your advantage in these situations in order to take the temperature down on the situation. Draw on the individual strengths of each child that you're working with. For example, if Bobby is particularly popular, you might say, "Bobby, a lot of kids like you, and I think that's because you really understand people well. I think that's going to help us figure this out." Or if Tanisha is especially kind and compassionate, you might say, Tanisha, you're a very thoughtful person. I think you really understand a lot about yourself, and I'm hoping that you can help me understand what's going on with you. The most important aspect of using your language is clearly communicating your desire to help the child. So one example of this would be, I want to make sure that you get the snack you want, but I need you to take a deep breath and talk to me for a couple minutes. In the case where you sense that a child is tuning you out, instead of directly demanding that he or she pay attention, simply ask the child to parrot back what you've just said. This will shift the reaction away from one of anger and a sense of injustice and towards one of awkwardness and slight embarrassment, which is marginally better, and which motivates better attention in the future. Be assertive if you're having trouble getting cooperation from the child, and threaten consequences only as our last resort at this stage. Try to use clear and concise instructions, such as, you need to sit down for a minute. Once the child is fully focused on you, determine whether the child needs to discuss or needs to process. You can do this by asking the question, do you want to tell me what happened? Step 3 in crisis management is hearing and validating the child. In this step, you'll first find out the perspective of each child involved by telling or asking that child what happened. If you ask, make sure to retell the child what you've heard to ensure that you've understood correctly. It also allows the child to feel fair and reasonable, which will help to de-escalate the situation. Next, make sure to identify the emotions that the child is feeling. An example of how to do this might be, oh, Jamie, so you're feeling angry. Or that must have been really embarrassing. After that emotion is identified, especially for the older and more insightful kids, you can identify the need behind the feeling by saying things like, oh, so you're really looking for friendship, or so you really want an apology. In any case, it's important to validate the feeling and differentiate that feeling between the feeling itself and the behavior that was exhibited. So saying things like, it makes sense that you felt this way, and it's okay to feel that way. But when you do feel that way, it's not okay to hit other kids. If you feel that the child is insightful enough to work on empathy, try to do this with the child. And the way that you would do this is by saying, oh, and how do you think your friend felt when you did this? Or how would you feel about that if you were your friend? When the child feels that you really understand their situation, it's time to move on to make a plan. If there are any consequences for the action that the child has exhibited, it's important to explain these actions and the reasons behind them. In the cases where an apology or a group discussion is necessary, it's important also to explain and discuss this. Remember, apologizing is more for the benefit of the child who is doing the apologizing, as much as for the other child who is being apologized to. It should not be a sense of humiliation that the child feels. There are two ways to engage a child in the plan process. The first is for the older and more insightful children who you want to be directly engaged in making their own plan for how to address similar situations in the future. For younger or less insightful children, you can simply tell them the plan, but you must ensure that it is clearly communicated. In either case, it's important to ensure agreement from the child and investment into their particular plan. So some ways to do this might be to say, oh, so if we did this plan, how would that be for you? Are you willing to try that? And their response would indicate whether they agree and to what extent they agree. The last step of managing a crisis is preparing a child to rejoin the group. So if apologizing is necessary, it's important at this stage to implement whatever plan has been discussed in the make a plan step. Restating the plan that you've made in a statement form will help to solidify agreement about the short-term future for that child. Make sure to take some time to praise and validate that child's participation in the problem-solving process and that child's willingness to reflect on their own behaviors. Keep in mind that this process is likely very draining and stressful for children, and identifying some small way to praise that child's participation will really help them take ownership in the future. You can signal that it's time to move on by saying something like, "Oh, okay, let's go ahead and put this behind us and get back to having fun." And in the cases where the child had to be sent home or was sent to the director's office and is rejoining the group after an absence, be sure to check in with that child about any feelings of anxiety that they might have about rejoining the group that might have arisen during that absence. Thanks so much for your attention and participation during this course. I hope the content proved useful and that you will be able to incorporate elements of this into your daily work.